Hello everyone and welcome. Today's video we're going to talk about linking multiple files to a single CSS file and code organization, which is a challenge that many of us are now struggling with. So at this point in the semester we've moved on to creating multiple pages of our professional portfolio website, and we're linking every HTML page to a single CSS page. This is kind of standard in web design. It allows us to reuse some code. So for example, here I have two pages, two HTML pages, a sort of home page and then a resume page. And they both have a header. And then inside that header, I've got, just a H1 and then a nav bar with the usual unordered list. And then I've got a main here. And my resume page has the same header with another H1 and another nav bar. And then its own main content here with the usual sort of resume information. Well, linking both HTML pages to a single CSS page allows me then to reuse all this code, because any code that I give, or any styling I give to my nav here or my nav li elements will apply to both pages. And I don't have to make multiple CSS pages and rewrite the same code over and over again. However, this does introduce some challenges, namely related to selectors and file organization. So let's do selectors first. Imagine if I wanted to take my home page here and have the main have a background color of, say, background color aqua. It doesn't look very good, but just work with me here. Maybe get some padding. Well, I've accomplished that by grabbing the main element, but now I've also added it to my resume because it also uses a main element. Let's say I didn't want to do this to my resume, then this causes some problems. So the way to get around this, and we've seen this a number of times in class, is to use a class name. So I might give my homepage main a class name of home main. And then instead of grabbing the main elements, I use the class selector home main with the .home main. And now the background color aqua and padding only applies to my home page, but not my resume page. And if I wanted to make adjustments to my resume main, then I might say give this a class name of resume main. And I can grab my resume main in a similar manner. So let's get this background color bisque, whatever that is. Okay, so you can use class names to kind of give yourself some more control over which pages you're editing and what elements on the page you are adding styles to. So that's that. And then but one problem that then emerges is as your CSS gets longer and longer, and as you add more HTML pages, your CSS could become multiple screen lengths of code, and it becomes difficult to remember exactly what each selector and style does and to which page. So there are various strategies people will use to organize their code and keep it readable as you add more and more to it. So the first I'm going to show you is comments. I'll start with the HTML actually. So comments are information you can add to a file that is not an element and does not appear on the page. So to write comments in HTML, you use this sort of notation. So it actually looks somewhat like an HTML element. You have an opening tag with the open brackets and then an exclamation point and then 2 dashes, and then a closing tag with 2 dashes and closing bracket. And anything inside those brackets is grayed out, and it's just sort of like things that you can type to tell anyone who's reading what's going on here. So I might say my main HTML. Or if I wanted, honestly, my sort of approach to writing HTML comments is usually they are not necessary for things like main and H2. because these elements are somewhat self-explanatory. However, a number of you are adding complicated code for logos or buttons or something that is a little more advanced. And the way you're doing it is you're adding a bunch of divs. And sometimes this is, inescapable. Sometimes we just have to use a lot of divs. But it can be very difficult to read the code and know what these divs are and what part of the page they correspond to. So this is where I would use HTML elements. So like I would do something like button, right? Just to tell my reader that, hey, this is the div, what's below here is for the button. And then I would know where on the page this code corresponds to. So that's HTML. And then I think the real value of comments for me is usually in the CSS. So to add comments in CSS, it's a little different. I'll just show you, I'll type the notation. So in CSS, you still have this idea of an opening bracket and a closing bracket, but it looks a little differently. So it's just slash asterisk is the opening bracket, and then asterisk slash is the closing. And then again, everything in between is grayed out, and it's just for reading purposes only. And then, I mean, it's a little frustrating to me that CSS comments don't have the same notation as HTML comments. I think that's a little, you have to memorize twice as many things. And I'd much prefer that this be the standard notation for comments because it's just easier for me to type. But this is the world we live in. So CSS comments are crucial for organizing your code and keeping all the elements neat when you have many, many pages. So the way I will often do it is just like this. So I'll have, let's say I have all my navigation code styling. I'll group it together. And then above it, I'll write in a code comment, usually all caps because I think it makes it more readable, navigation. And if you wanted to give it a little more emphasis, you can give it some spacing. And then let's say I have all my code for my home page, then I would do the same. I would do home page. And then the same for resume. So all my homepage code would go in between these two code comments, and all my resume code would go after the resume. And so that's one way to keep your code organized. And I would stress that you start doing this because, again, as you add more pages, you may not see this now, but as you add more pages, it will become more difficult to read your CSS code, and it will get this sort of feeling of getting bloated. And you might sort of find yourself reading every line and trying to remember, what does this do again? Well, if you stay organized as you write the code and you keep the code for each page organized in comments, then you don't have to read every single line, and it can reduce the work you do later. And honestly, you will reduce the work that I have to do when I look at your HTML and CSS code. I want it to be readable for me, your instructor. So these comments really help. Other things that help, I have been seeing some people, their code is correct, but it's a little sloppy. So they'll do things like this, or like this. And the computer can read this, but it's much more difficult for a human to read. So I recommend that when you're coding, take this mentality of, you're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. Like, make sure your code is neat and appropriate, like has consistent formatting throughout, so no extra spaces unless you think it makes it easier to read. None of this stuff where properties begin on the same line that the selector is on. No like messed up indentation. Just keep it nice and neat throughout. It makes it so much easier for you and for me to read. And then the final thing, I've been noticing people doing weird things with their class names. So I have noticed people, when they make class names, instead of home main, they'll do something like one, right? Or, one, and then the next class will be two. I mean, that works technically, but then you go into a situation like this, where someone's reading your CSS and they just see something's named one, and they don't know what that is. It is not a very semantic class name. It doesn't give a lot of meaning to what you're styling here. So at all times, I recommend that you go, when you name your classes, think about what on the page this class is and where it's named, or sorry, what it can be named that would give the most amount of meaning to your class. So I just like home main, because that tells you what page it is, and then also the element's name, so that it keeps it as clear as possible, I would say. And there are different approaches and strategies for naming classes, but as long as it's descriptive and someone can figure out what you're grabbing, or reasonably figure out what you're grabbing by looking at your name, I think that's what's important. Oh, and then I guess one more thing. Let's say I wanted to, on my home page, I've got my main, right? And I wanted to style the P inside my main. Well, one thing I could do is I could add a class to P, so like home paragraph. And then I could go to my CSS, and in my home page section, I could add a home paragraph. And let's say I give it font family Arial. For whatever reason, I wanted to give it Arial. So you could do this. I think that a better approach might be to, instead of giving it a class name, to use the parent selector. So I might do something like home main P, and then font family Arial. These have the same effect in the page, but they function a little differently. So the first one, where I use a class name, home paragraph, what you're effectively asking someone who's reading your code to do is look at two class names and try to remember, or intuit what each class name is doing. And it's kind of twice the mental work. Whereas with home P, we use the same class name, and we just say that I want any paragraphs that are a descendant of home main to be font family Arial. So you can use these kinds of parent class elements to keep your CSS and HTML a little bit less cluttered with a bunch of class names. I think that's my last suggestion for organizing your code. All right, well, so far people's pages look great. If you have questions about this video, shoot me an email or shoot your instructor an email. That's it.